From the moment I moved into the neighborhood, I knew the HOA wasn't going to make things easy. At first, it was little things. Letters reminding me about lawn care, friendly suggestions about the color of my mailbox, and occasional slips tucked under my door about garbage bin placement. It was annoying, sure, but nothing worth losing sleep over. But everything changed when I bought my truck. It wasn't a rusted-out clunker, nor was it an oversized monstrosity taking up 3 spaces. It was a well-maintained, full-size pickup. For me, it was more than just a vehicle. It was my workhorse. I used it for weekend projects, hauling supplies, and even helping my neighbors when they needed something moved. Most people loved it. But apparently the HOA didn't. It started with a letter. A crisp white envelope slid neatly into my mailbox, stamped with the official HOA logo in bold navy blue. Inside, I found a notice claiming that my truck was a non-compliant vehicle under the association's regulations. According to them, pickup trucks, regardless of size or condition, were not permitted to be parked in driveways overnight. They were considered commercial vehicles, and therefore a violation of community standards. I couldn't believe it. My truck wasn't commercial. It didn't have logos, ladders, or equipment racks. It wasn't plastered with advertisements. It was just a truck, my truck. Still, the letter was clear. I had 14 days to remove the vehicle or face escalating fines starting at $100 per day. At first, I brushed it off, assuming it was some kind of mistake. Surely, no one in their right mind would actually fine a homeowner for parking their own vehicle in their own driveway. But when the second notice arrived, this time in bold red lettering, I realized they were serious. The neighbors started whispering. Some told me stories about how the HOA had gone after them for lawn ornaments, backyard sheds, even holiday decorations. Others admitted they'd been fined before for things as ridiculous as leaving a trash can visible for more than an hour after pickup. The more I heard, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about my truck. It was about control. For a while, I tried to comply. I parked my truck on the street just outside the neighborhood gates, walking the extra distance each evening. But within a week, I found a bright orange sticker on my windshield, warning that unauthorized vehicles would be towed if left unattended. Apparently, the HOA had convinced the city to restrict overnight parking near the neighborhood as well. That's when the fines started rolling in. First one, then another. Each notice harsher than the last, demanding payment and threatening legal action. They were determined to break me, to bend me to their will, but they underestimated one. The turning point came one Saturday morning, when I woke up to the sound of a tow truck rumbling outside my window. I rushed out to find a driver hooking up my truck, preparing to haul it away. Luckily, I had parked in the garage the night before, but the sight was enough to confirm my fears. The HOA wasn't bluffing. They were willing to take my property by force. That's when I decided I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to make a statement. I spent the next few days researching the HOA bylaws, combing through every page, every clause, every definition. I discovered a loophole, one they had overlooked. The rules stated that non-compliant vehicles could not be parked in driveways or on streets within the community. But nowhere did it say anything about the community clubhouse. The clubhouse sat at the center of the neighborhood, a pristine building with a neatly landscaped lawn, a pool out back, and a row of parking spaces right in front. Those spaces were technically owned by the association, designated for residents during community events. And according to the rules, as long as I was a member in good standing, I had the right to use them. An idea began to form. Something bold. Something that would turn their own rules against them. But I couldn't just rush into it. I needed to be careful, deliberate. If I made the wrong move, they'd fine me into oblivion. If I made the right one, however, I'd embarrass them in front of the entire neighborhood. The more I thought about it, the more determined I became. They had tried to tow my truck to intimidate me into compliance. Now I was going to give them exactly what they didn't want, front row seats to the one vehicle they hated the most. And when I finally made my move, it wouldn't just be about winning. It would be about teaching them a lesson they'd never forget. The plan was simple, but the execution would take timing, precision, and a little bit of audacity. I knew that once I put my truck there, the HOA would lose their minds. The question was, how far would they go to stop me? As I sat in my living room that night, staring out the window at the driveway they claimed I couldn't use, I realized something important. This wasn't just about a truck anymore. It was about freedom, about standing up to an organization that thought they could control every detail of people's lives, and I was ready to fight. The next morning, I started preparing. The morning I carried out my plan, the air felt unusually still, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. The sun rose slowly, casting long shadows across the quiet streets, and the manicured lawns glistened with dew. Everything seemed perfectly in order. Too perfect. I knew what I was about to do would disrupt that fragile sense of control the HOA clung to. But I also knew I had the rules on my side. That made me untouchable, at least for now. I waited until late morning when the neighborhood was most alive. Dog walkers, joggers, and parents pushing strollers filled the sidewalks. The HOA board members loved this time of day. It was their stage. They'd stroll around, clipboards in hand, proudly inspecting their little kingdom. It was the perfect audience for what I was about to do. I opened my garage and started the engine. The rumble of the truck echoed down the street, turning heads immediately. A few neighbors waved. Others whispered, already curious about where I was going. But no one expected what came next. I drove slowly, deliberately, making my way to the very heart of the community, the clubhouse. The building stood tall, with its neatly trimmed hedges and flagpole out front. It was the HOA's pride and joy, the place they used to host meetings, parties, and events. And in front of it, like a crown jewel, sat a row of pristine parking spaces. Spaces that belonged to every member, including me. I pulled in, taking the most prominent spot, directly in front of the entrance. I parked perfectly centered, angled so that anyone entering the clubhouse would see my truck first. It wasn't just parked. It was displayed for a moment. Silence followed. Then, one by one, people began to notice. Dog walkers slowed their pace. Neighbors paused mid-conversation. A few even stopped to take pictures. The sight of my truck sitting boldly in front of the clubhouse was enough to send a ripple of excitement through the community. And then came the board members, the HOA president. A woman who prided herself on being the neighborhood's self-appointed guardian approached first. She froze when she saw the truck, her face tightening as if she'd just discovered graffiti on her own front door. Soon, other board members joined her, circling like vultures. Clipboards were raised. Notes were scribbled furiously, but here's the thing, they couldn't touch it. I sat back in my chair at home later that day, watching from a distance as the board huddled in front of my truck, clearly arguing. I knew exactly what they were saying. They wanted it gone. They wanted to tow it, fine it, or do anything that would erase the embarrassment of having the one vehicle they hated parked in their sacred space. But the rules were clear. As long as I was a dues-paying member, I had the right to use those spaces. There was no clause excluding trucks, no mention of aesthetic standards for vehicles in the clubhouse lot. I had found the loophole, and I was exploiting it in plain sight. By the end of the first day, the HOA had already sent me an official letter. They strongly requested that I move my truck from the clubhouse parking lot, citing that it was not in the spirit of community harmony. But requests weren't rules, and I didn't move it. The next day, the neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Some people loved what I had done. They said it was about time someone stood up to the HOA. Others were nervous, worried that my defiance would bring stricter rules for everyone. But regardless of their opinions, one thing was clear. Everyone was talking about it. Each time I drove the truck back to the clubhouse lot, more eyes followed me. Some neighbors clapped quietly. Others shook their heads. But I didn't care. I wasn't doing this for approval. I was doing it to prove a point, that the HOA couldn't control everything, no matter how badly they wanted to. Of course, the board didn't give up easily. Over the next week, they escalated their tactics. They placed warning signs near the clubhouse, claiming that the spaces were for short-term use only. They tried locking the lot at night, only to receive complaints from residents who also wanted to use it. They even called the city to see if they could enforce municipal codes, but none of it worked. Every loophole they tried to close only made them look more desperate. And every morning, without fail, my truck sat proudly in front of their building, a silent reminder that I wasn't backing down. It wasn't long before the situation turned into a spectacle. Residents began gathering around the clubhouse in the evenings, chatting and laughing as they admired the boldness of my stunt. Some even brought lawn chairs, turning it into a kind of neighborhood protest. The HOA had tried to make me an example. Instead, I had become a symbol, but symbols have power, and power breeds enemies. One night after I had parked the truck and gone home, I received a knock on my door. When I opened it, no one was there, but taped to the doorframe was a note. It wasn't from the HOA. It was handwritten, shaky, and angry. It said, "Move the truck or else." That was the first real threat. The next morning, I inspected my truck carefully. No scratches, no damage, but the note made it clear someone had taken this personally. Maybe it was a board member. Maybe it was a neighbor who had grown tired of the drama. Either way, things were starting to escalate beyond the usual fines and letters. The HOA had lost their grip on the situation, and now the tension was spreading through the entire neighborhood. People were taking sides. Some cheered for me. Others whispered about consequences. And all the while, the board grew more desperate to regain control. But I wasn't scared. If anything, the note only confirmed what I already knew. My truck wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was a challenge, a direct insult to their authority. And as long as it sat there, front and center, they couldn't ignore me. The question was, how far would they go to make me stop? By the end of the second week, the HOA scheduled an emergency meeting. Notices were delivered to every house, urging residents to attend. The subject line was short and direct: Community Standards Crisis. I knew exactly what that meant. They weren't just going after my truck anymore. They were going after me, and I was ready. The notice for the emergency HOA meeting arrived with a kind of urgency I had never seen before. Usually, meetings were announced weeks in advance, with carefully printed agendas and neat reminders about snacks or refreshments. But this one came as a stark, single-page letter in bold print. Emergency meeting, attendance strongly encouraged. Community Standards Crisis. There was no subtlety, no fluff, just panic disguised as professionalism. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the clubhouse, the very place my truck had been sitting like an uninvited guest for weeks. The irony wasn't lost on me. They wanted to gather the community to condemn me, all while standing under the shadow of the very symbol they despised. When Thursday arrived, the parking lot was fuller than I had ever seen it. Cars lined the curb, and neighbors filed in with a mix of curiosity and frustration on their faces. Some carried folded arms and scowls, others carried lawn chairs, clearly expecting a show. And right in the middle of it all, gleaming in the evening light, sat my truck. I didn't walk in right away. Instead, I stood outside for a while, watching as the crowd grew. I could hear snippets of conversation floating through the air, some supportive, others bitter. Words like ridiculous, and finally someone stood up to them, and he's ruining it for everyone, overlapped like competing whispers. The neighborhood was split, and the tension was heavy. Finally, I stepped inside. The clubhouse was buzzing with noise, but it quieted the moment I entered. Eyes turned toward me, some glaring, others nodding in quiet approval. At the front of the room, the HOA board sat at a long table, papers and binders stacked in front of them like weapons. The president, a woman with a permanent tight smile that never reached her eyes, sat in the middle like a general about to lead her. Troops, she wasted no time. The meeting opened with a long-winded speech about community, standards, aesthetic values, and the integrity of our neighborhood image. She used every phrase in the HOA handbook, twisting words until they sounded like gospel. According to her, my truck was not just a vehicle, it was a threat, a stain, a symbol of rebellion that endangered everything the community stood for. But then she made a mistake. She invited the residents to share their opinions. The first few voices were exactly what the board wanted. A man in the front row complained about property values. A woman beside him muttered about rules being rules. The board nodded approvingly, feeding off their frustration. But then, something shifted. A neighbor from across the street stood up. She was quiet at first, but her words carried weight. She said she was tired of the HOA's constant nitpicking, how she had been fined for leaving a flower pot on her porch. She admitted she admired what I had done, even if she didn't own a truck herself. Her voice shook, but her conviction was clear. Others followed. A young couple complained about being fined for their kids' toys left in the yard. An older man recounted how he had been ordered to repaint his perfectly fine shutters because the shade of blue wasn't approved. Slowly, voices grew louder, stories piled up, and the board's carefully constructed control began to unravel. It wasn't just about my truck anymore. It was about years of frustration. The president's tight smile faltered as the room buzzed with discontent. She tried to regain control, slamming her gavel and repeating phrases like order and community standards, but it was too late. The residents had found their voices, and the board could no longer silence them. When it was finally my turn to speak, I didn't need to raise my voice. I simply reminded everyone of the truth. I had read the bylaws. I had followed the rules, even if it meant exposing the loopholes. My truck was legally parked in a spot I was entitled to use. The HOA had tried to fine me, tow me, and intimidate me, but I hadn't broken a single rule. And then I said something that made the board visibly flinch. If this is about control, then call it control. But don't hide behind words like harmony or community, because what I see here tonight isn't harmony. It's frustration, it's resentment, and it's growing louder every day. The room erupted. Some cheered, others clapped, and even those who remained silent couldn't ignore the truth of it. The HOA had pushed too far for too long, and my truck had simply been the spark that lit the fire. The board ended the meeting abruptly after that, clearly shaken. They promised to review the bylaws and consider amendments, but their authority no longer felt absolute. The residents had seen the cracks, and no amount of gavel slamming could hide them now. As the crowd dispersed, people stopped to thank me. Some shook my hand. Others whispered words of encouragement. A few even admitted they were afraid of retaliation, but were glad someone had taken a stand. But not everyone was supportive. As I walked back to my truck, parked defiantly in front of the clubhouse, I noticed a group of board members huddled together, their faces tight with anger. They weren't just embarrassed, they were furious. And fury makes people reckless. Weren't going to let that go. And then, just past midnight, I heard the sound. A distant rumble. The low growl of a diesel engine. I looked out the window and my heart skipped a beat. A tow truck had entered the neighborhood. Its headlights swept across lawns, moving slowly, methodically. It was heading straight for the clubhouse. The sound of the tow truck rolling through the neighborhood wasn't just noise. It was a declaration of war. I stood at my window in the dark, watching the headlights creep slowly toward the clubhouse. The driver's intent was clear. They weren't here for a random car. They were here for mine. The HOA had lost control at the meeting. They had been humiliated in front of their neighbors, exposed for the petty tyrants they were. And now, under cover of night, they were trying to reclaim their authority the only way they knew how, by force. I slipped on my shoes and stepped outside quietly. The night air was heavy, thick with tension, as though the whole neighborhood was holding its breath again. I stayed in the shadows, moving closer as the tow truck pulled into the clubhouse lot. There it was, my truck, gleaming under the harsh beams of the tow truck's headlights. The driver got out, his movements quick and practiced. He wasn't fumbling. He knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't his first midnight tow. But this time, he wasn't towing just any vehicle. This time, he was towing mine. As the driver crouched to hook the chains, I stepped forward from the shadows. I didn't shout. I didn't run. I simply walked, calm and deliberate, until I was standing within view. The driver froze, startled, and for a moment we locked eyes. That's when I pulled out my phone. I had been expecting this. From the moment I parked my truck at the clubhouse, I knew the HOA wouldn't stop at letters and threats. They were predictable, and I was ready. My phone's camera light cut through. The darkness, illuminating everything, the tow truck, the chains, the driver caught in the act. The driver muttered something under his breath, clearly frustrated, but he didn't touch my truck again. He knew better. Without a direct order from the police or a court, towing a vehicle from HOA-owned property at night was skating on thin legal ice, and with me recording, he wasn't willing to risk it. The standoff didn't last long. The driver climbed back into his truck, revved the engine, and backed out of the lot. The growl of the diesel faded into the distance, leaving only silence behind. But the damage was already done. The HOA had crossed a line. They had gone from writing fines and posting letters to staging midnight raids, and I had caught them red-handed. The next morning, I uploaded the video, not just to the neighborhood forum, but to a wider audience. Social media, local community groups. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. People were outraged, not just at the HOA's pettiness, but at the underhanded way they had tried to enforce it. The comments poured in. Some people laughed, calling it the most HOA thing they'd ever seen. Others were furious, demanding accountability. A few even offered legal advice, pointing out the violations the HOA might have committed by ordering the tow. By the afternoon, the board was in full panic mode. Another letter arrived at my door, this one dripping with legal jargon demanding I take down the video. They claimed it defamed the association and violated community privacy. But the more they threatened, the more people shared it. The HOA had gone viral, and not in a way they wanted. Neighbors stopped me on the street, whispering their support. Some who had once been too afraid to speak up now came forward with their own stories. Tales of harassment, fines, and intimidation surfaced like hidden cracks in the foundation. My truck had become a rallying point, a symbol of resistance against years of silent suffering. But with every new supporter, the board grew more desperate. 2 nights later, I found another note taped to my door. Unlike the first, this one wasn't just angry, it was personal. You think you're clever, but this won't end with your truck. Watch yourself. The words were scrawled hastily, but the message was clear. They weren't just targeting my vehicle anymore, they were targeting me. For the first time, I felt a flicker of unease. Trucks can be defended, rules can be argued, but threats like that, those cross into dangerous territory. Still, I wasn't about to back down. If anything, the threat only fueled me further. So, I decided to raise the stakes. The next weekend, the HOA was hosting one of its prized community events at the clubhouse, a summer gathering complete with catered food, music, and speeches about unity, the perfect backdrop for my next move. Early that morning, I polished the truck until it gleamed. Then I drove it, slowly and deliberately, right back into the same spot in front of the clubhouse. Only this time, I added something extra. Mounted in the truck bed was a giant banner. Bright, bold letters stretched across it, impossible to ignore. My truck, my driveway, my rights. By noon, the lot was full of cars, neighbors milling about in their summer clothes, children running across the grass. And towering above it all was my truck, banner flying high, right in the heart of the event. The HOA board was furious. Their faces turned red, their smiles cracked, and their carefully rehearsed speeches fell flat as residents pointed, laughed, and snapped photos. The event, meant to showcase their control and community spirit, had turned into a spectacle they couldn't contain. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that the board wasn't done yet. They weren't just embarrassed now. They were plotting. And this time, they weren't going to play by the rules. The summer event at the clubhouse was supposed to be the HOA's moment of triumph, a chance to display their authority and community harmony to everyone in attendance. Instead, it turned into their greatest humiliation. The sight of my truck parked front and center, gleaming in the sun with that bold banner waving above it, was a wound they couldn't cover. Neighbors gathered around it, laughing, snapping photos and whispering stories about all the ridiculous fines they'd endured. The HOA president tried to deliver her speech over the music and chatter, but every time she raised her voice, another burst of laughter echoed across the lawn. Their power had cracked, and everyone could see it. But humiliation breeds desperation, and desperate people are dangerous. The very next week, the letters started again. Only this time, they weren't simple fines. They were legal threats. The board claimed that my banner violated advertising restrictions in the bylaws. They said my truck constituted unauthorized signage and threatened to pursue legal action if I didn't remove it. I wasn't surprised. I had expected them to twist the rules, to dig into every dusty page of the bylaws until they found something, anything, they could use against me. But I also knew the difference between threats and enforceable action. Their letters were carefully worded but hollow, more bark than bite. Still, they didn't stop there. One morning, I discovered a notice taped directly to my front door. It wasn't signed by the board this time. It was from an attorney, or at least someone claiming to represent the HOA. The letter accused me of willful non-compliance and threatened a lawsuit that could result in liens placed on my property. It was an escalation, no doubt, but something about the letter felt off. The formatting was sloppy, the language unprofessional, and when I looked up the attorney's name, no such person existed in the state directory. It was a bluff, a forged letter designed to scare me into submission. That was the moment I realized just how far they were willing to go. They weren't just misinterpreting bylaws anymore. They were inventing authority they didn't have. Word of the fake letter spread quickly after I shared it online. Neighbors were outraged, and whispers about replacing the board grew louder. Some even suggested suing the HOA as a group. The board, once feared, was now being openly mocked. But the more their influence slipped, the harder they tried to claw it back. They began sending inspectors to my property, combing over every inch of my home for violations. A single blade of grass too long earned me a warning. A garden hose left coiled by the fence became a tripping hazard. Even a shadow on my driveway from an overhanging branch was deemed unsightly. It was harassment, plain and simple, and yet each new violation only added fuel to the fire. More neighbors joined my side, fed up with being treated like criminals in their own homes. My truck had become more than a symbol now. It was a movement, but the board wasn't finished. One evening, as I sat on my porch, I noticed unfamiliar faces walking the neighborhood. They weren't residents. They carried clipboards, snapped photos, and spoke quietly into phones. Later, I learned the HOA had hired a private compliance company. Outsiders brought in to intimidate us, to document every possible excuse for fines. It was a last-ditch attempt to restore fear. But instead of cowing the community, it united them further. People began openly challenging the inspectors, following them around, questioning their authority. Videos surfaced online, neighbors confronting these strangers and demanding answers. The HOA had wanted compliance, but what they got was rebellion. Then came the final straw. One night, just after midnight, I heard a sharp crash outside my house. I rushed out to find my mailbox smashed, pieces scattered across the lawn. Spray painted across the pavement in front of my driveway were 3 words: "Move the truck." It was no longer about rules or bylaws. This was personal. I filed a police report, but I knew there was little chance they'd catch whoever did it. Still, I wasn't shaken. If anything, I felt more resolved than ever. The board had resorted to vandalism, to scare tactics, to flat-out lies. They had lost the battle for legitimacy. All that was left was raw hostility, and I wasn't going to let them win, so I planned my final move. For weeks, I had been careful, calculated. I had stayed within the rules, used their own bylaws against them. But now it was time for something bigger, something they couldn't ignore, something that would strip away what little authority they had left. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following month. It was supposed to be routine, a chance for the board to save face, to reassert control. But I had something else in mind. I gathered evidence. Every letter, every fake threat, every video of inspectors harassing residents. I compiled it all, organized, documented, undeniable. And then I reached out to someone the HOA hadn't expected, the local news. When the night of the meeting arrived, the clubhouse was packed. Tension buzzed in the air, thicker than ever before. The board sat at their table, smug expressions plastered on their faces, confident they could bluff their way through another evening. But this time, There were cameras in the back of the room, reporters, microphones, and neighbors who weren't afraid anymore. I didn't even need to say much. I simply handed over the evidence, and the truth spoke for itself. The fake legal threats, the harassment, the vandalism, it all painted a picture of a board that had gone rogue. The room erupted. Residents shouted, demanding resignations. Cameras rolled, capturing every red-faced board member as their carefully constructed facade crumbled. The HOA had tried to tow my truck, to bully me into submission, to break me with threats and lies. Instead, they had exposed themselves for what they really were, petty tyrants drunk on control. And in that moment, standing in the center of the storm, I knew the fight was almost over, but the final blow was still to come. The clubhouse had never seen such chaos. What was supposed to be another routine HOA meeting had turned into a spectacle of anger, betrayal, and exposure. The cameras didn't miss a moment. Reporters scribbled furiously as residents shouted over one another, demanding answers. The board members, once untouchable figures perched on their pedestal of authority, sat frozen behind their table, pale and silent. Every ounce of control they thought they had evaporated that night. The fake attorney letter, the intimidation tactics, the private inspectors, all of it was out in the open now. Neighbors who had once grumbled quietly behind closed doors were standing tall, their voices raised in unison. The truth had given them courage. And the board couldn't stop the tidal wave that followed. Resignations came quickly. First, the treasurer stormed out mid-meeting, muttering about not wanting to deal with lawsuits. Then the secretary slipped away without a word, leaving only the president and her most loyal ally clinging to their seats. They tried to deny the evidence, to twist the story into one of miscommunication and misunderstandings. But no one was buying it anymore. The local news ran the story the next morning under the headline, "Neighborhood Rebellion, HOA accused of harassment and abuse of power." The footage spoke for itself. Angry residents, stacks of forged letters, inspectors caught on camera harassing homeowners. And front and center in almost every shot was my truck, the very symbol of defiance the board had tried so desperately to erase. The community erupted. Some residents celebrated openly, honking their horns as they drove past my house. Others began organizing petitions to formally remove the remaining board members. Even people from nearby neighborhoods reached out, sharing their own HOA horror stories and offering support. The board tried to fight back, of course. The president released a statement claiming she was the victim of a smear campaign. She said the truck was a deliberate provocation and that I was exploiting the situation for attention. But her words fell flat. Too much evidence, too many witnesses, too many cracks in their story. Within weeks, a special election was scheduled. The old guard was out. New leaders, people actually chosen by the residents, stepped in to restore order. Their first act? Repealing the absurd vehicle restrictions that had started this entire war. And just like that, my truck was no longer non-compliant. But the victory didn't stop there. The fake attorney letter was investigated. And though no one admitted to writing it, enough suspicion lingered to permanently tarnish the reputations of the board members involved. Rumors swirled that one of them had even faced disciplinary action at their day job because of the exposure. What they had tried to use as a weapon against me had backfired spectacularly. The community itself transformed. Where fear and silence once ruled, now there was laughter, conversation, and a sense of unity. Neighbors who had barely spoken to one another before now gathered for block parties, meetings, and casual hangouts. My truck was still parked in the same spot, and every time people walked past, they treated it like a mascot. A reminder of what happens when ordinary residents refuse to bow to petty tyrants. But I wasn't finished just yet. You see, I had one last move. Not out of spite, but to make sure the lesson stuck forever. When the new board invited me to the first meeting under their leadership, I brought a proposal. I suggested installing a permanent community display in front of the clubhouse. A small landscaped area with a stone plaque commemorating the residents' victory over HOA abuse. And right next to it, I offered to park my truck, legally. Proudly, during every future community event, the idea passed unanimously. And so, On the very lawn where the old board had once tried to humiliate me, my truck now stood as a monument. Not a nuisance, not a violation, but a symbol of resilience and unity. Kids climbed onto its bumper during gatherings, families posed for photos beside it, and neighbors laughed about the absurdity of the battles we'd fought. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very vehicle the board had tried to erase had become the centerpiece of the neighborhood. In time, the sting of harassment faded. The vandalism, the fake threats, the inspectors, those memories grew dull compared to the joy of what we'd built in their place. But no one forgot the lesson. Power only works when people are too afraid to resist. The HOA had tried to tow my truck, to find me, to break me with intimidation. Instead, they had exposed their own corruption, lost their grip on the community, and handed me the ultimate victory. Now, every time I step outside and see my truck gleaming in the sunlight, parked exactly where they said it didn't belong, I smile. Not just because I won, but because we all did. The HOA thought they could bury me. But all they did was plant the seed of rebellion. And from that seed grew something far stronger than their petty rules. A community unafraid to stand tall. The battle was over. The war was won. And my truck? It wasn't going anywhere.